we've been welcomed, we've been contextualized, we've been challenged a little bit as well. How do we respond in a way that's not just committed but coordinated? And not just creative, but as we've crucially heard, quick. Nowhere in the world better endowed than Europe with the resources and the skills, the organizations and individuals to meet and beat these grand challenges we keep banging on about, and there is still plenty more banging to come. But could we do more to manage and to galvanize all these fantastic resources that are at our disposal to make sure we have not just the optimal people, but the optimal formations, the optimal combinations to get the job done and get the job done quickly? Because yet again, we're up against that clock. How do we maximize innovation and minimize duplication? These are themes I believe our keynote speaker is about to explore. It is my great pleasure to introduce the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, Sheila Jasanoff.
Well, thank you, Quentin. I'm not sure that I can satisfy your urge for speed. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for the gracious invitation to be present at this meeting. Thank you, Madam Minister, and ladies and gentlemen. It's hard to describe what it means for an academic in my kind of line of work to be standing talking about these issues to people who are doing this work on a day-to-day basis, and some of whom have devoted their lifetimes to thinking about precisely the issues that I'm going to be talking about. And let me begin by saying that whereas the talk thus far has been about collaboration and about positive ways forward, maybe my job is to do the opposite of what Quentin wants and suggest that there is perhaps more friction in the system that one needs to pay attention to, and maybe that too is one of the grand challenges for research. So with that, let me cover some of the same territory that you've already heard. So beginning with the minister's talk about the kind of condition we're in the world today, and she didn't mention San Bernardino along with Beirut and Paris, but one could talk about things in my country as well. There are many tragedies, many problems going on in the world at the moment that the research community needs to be aware of, and the grand challenges are shifting on a daily basis. So it turns out that I can't read my own slides from the angle that I'm at, but in any case, we've heard that this is what the Lund Declaration said, focus on the grand challenges of our time. And it's well to keep in mind the historical point that we've already mentioned. Europe is not standing in 2015 on day one of thinking about grand challenges. There already are many European achievements that have that represent, that symbolize Europe and indeed the world coming together to face a number of grand challenges. Earlier this year, I was at CERN, and this demonstration of Atlas caught my eye because of the text, which was a ringing affirmation, a paean to curiosity-driven research. And here is the text worth quoting. Is it a futile pursuit when time is short? There are inequalities in the distribution of material goods, and nature herself is under attack. No, for this essential quest is a contribution to keeping humankind on the path of curiosity and intelligence, thereby enhancing our pride as human beings. Well, you will see there a text that affirms the value of curiosity-driven research as itself a kind of grand challenge, and it is speaking universally on behalf of humanity, saying that we would be lesser human beings if we didn't pursue the kind of research that led to the Higgs boson, for instance, that we've already heard about. Well, if you turn, however, to the science societies, the major science societies that are active in the world today, you see a somewhat different language, and a language that repeats itself across frontiers. So you see for the benefit of society as part of ICSU's mission statement. You see advancing science, serving society with typical American efficiency. We only have 4 words that capture the point, that the Académie des Sciences takes a lot more to do in French, but in any event, we see a kind of convergence in the ways in which the academies of science are speaking. And it's well to remember that this is very different language from the language that I pointed out at CERN. So the Lund Declaration, of course, comes with a certain number of questions. And since the theme of alignment was one of the first presented, and it's my honor to be starting the discussion this morning on that topic, I'm going to focus mainly on this last question, the steps that should be taken by the academic community, industry, civil society, and funding agencies. So there we already have a picture of the kind of collaboration that's needed, and it's a collaboration that's very different from what we heard about in the Commissioner's last words, because there we were talking about interdisciplinary collaboration across fields and within academia, but now we're talking about collaboration that cuts across societal sectors, specifically talks about civil society, which, by the way, although it's an English term comprehensible in dictionary meaning to anyone who speaks the English language, it's not comprehensible in a political sense in the country that I live in and I'm a citizen of. So it's interesting to remember that civil society is a term that comes trippingly off of European tongues, but is less a term that Americans want to think in terms of. So how do we proceed from that point? Well, one of the things to notice is how quickly the talk, when it's from scientists' mouths, keeps slipping back into the CERN type of vision of grand challenges, that it is a matter of getting the science right in such a way that it informs public policy. I will be talking in much more detail about the climate change challenge just as an example of the kind of place where I think the frictions arise. But as a precursor, it's useful to point out that the IPCC, which is the best translation agent we have in the world for converting knowledge into public policy, has a very old-fashioned view of its mission and keeps stating and asserting this all the time. The work of the organization is therefore policy relevant and yet policy neutral, never policy prescriptive. Now, you might say that that is actually a misrepresentation, since the IPCC has done more to elevate climate change as an agenda item, and rightfully so. So why disregard that? Why disregard that in the rhetoric? Should not the rhetoric in some sense correspond better to the kind of linkage, the deep and profound linkage that we see as observers of the scene in the ways that science and science's goals in society necessarily come together and necessarily involve something other than neutrality and something that borders on prescription. So why not embrace that prescriptive quality of doing policy-relevant science by the horns and then think about what the politics needs to be in order to carry out that kind of science, which necessarily is going to impinge on politics and values, especially if we're talking about the global scale. Willy-nilly, Europe, in spite of all its divisions, shares a lot more than, for instance, Tunisia and Ukraine, to take 2 countries that were mentioned, and these are not the polar extremes and opposites in the world either. So, to some degree, scientists' imaginations in how to tackle these challenges and how to do science for society still is constrained, I would submit, by this kind of separatist model in which the science is sitting somewhere apart from society and still immersed mainly in getting the science right. I think we have to shift to a mindset in which we're equally and at the same time and with similar energy talking about getting the right science. So what is the knowledge we need in order to tackle the things that are coming out of society? How do we even know what the grand challenges are? It's easy enough to say, well, it has to be water, it has to be climate. I mean, we know, at least those of us who are in this room, know what some of the problems confronting civilization are at a biogeophysical level in the Anthropocene. But is it obvious that if one consulted and did a survey of 1 billion people in China or 1 billion people in India, the same grand challenges would emerge as the ones that are guiding European research at the moment? What are those framings? Where are they coming from? Public policy, moreover, we know is a vehicle for defining the public good, and to what extent is scientific research in setting out its agenda, defining the public good, but without the kind of democratic process by which we want legislatures to be defining the public good? And how do we decide which science and technology to choose? It's one thing to say interdisciplinary, but I can guarantee you that if you go around the universities of this continent or my continent, the new buildings are not being devoted to ethical centers, for instance. They're the biochemistry labs, they're the new hospitals, they're the new physics facilities, they're new chemistry buildings. They're not being dedicated to the social sciences and the humanities to anything like the same degree. Maybe it's cheaper kinds of science in those fields, but one could ask whether the balance has been struck in the right way. So how do we do the science and technology that will link us up to the right questions? That, I think, remains a challenge below the challenge of producing the best science. Now, I said I come to this assembly in humility, and that's partly because, in spite of my American status as somebody embedded in the American university system with all of my higher education, with very few exceptions, done in America. Nevertheless, I've been privileged to be part of the European science policy discussion for a very long time. And one thing I've seen, therefore, is the recurrence, the life cycle of ideas that keep coming back. And what we're talking about, therefore, is not falling onto new territory. And so I want to say that I acknowledge that. And the question is, in these turns of the wheel, is it a recurrent coming back to the same place, or do we cyclically move on? And if so, where incrementally have we moved to now? So this, for instance, is taken from a 2003 report on the governance of the European research area and the particular role of civil society. And all I want to do, which to any European is familiar anyway, is to point out what a great fertility this group of nations has in generating acronyms. And these acronyms stand for various initiatives that have already done some of the intellectual work that we're talking about here. And I was privileged to be part of that discussion. I was also privileged to be part of a discussion that led to this report in 2007, which I'm not sure the Commission ever took as seriously as its authors did. But in any case, there is the point that we are talking about territory in which thinking work has already been done. And if we're going to be serious about the history, to what extent are we mining that thinking work that has already been done in order to build the basis for going forward? So let me give you a little bit of a potted history to suggest from the American example why it's necessary to go back and sort of rethink some of this territory over and over again. In our case, historically, the beginnings of science and technology policy are often attributed to the person on the left, Vannevar Bush, informally speaking, the first major presidential science advisor we had, and then the book, suitably anonymous. I like showing its picture because it is so much not what one would show now in the visual age, but maybe Science, the Endless Frontier, that black ground with science leaping out in white letters is somehow a suitable metaphor for what Vannevar Bush was talking about. And the idea there was that there was a kind of contract built in between science and society for innovation, and so much so that one can even call them central dogmas, like the central dogma of biology, that there are certain things that we cannot question. National governments have a duty to sponsor science and technology. Why? Because more science leads to more innovation, and innovation is social well-being, and then science should be let alone, should be left to self-regulate. If there are problems, the problems can be corrected at the back end, but there's no need for front-end involvement by society. This was more or less the understanding for the first 30, 40 years after World War II about the way in which science policy ought to be run, not just in the United States, but it was stated more explicitly there perhaps than in some other places. There are lots of illustrations for how this was done, but one can speak of the expansion or the creation of new science funding agencies. The whole idea that, for instance, that the National Science Foundation should be devoted only to basic research, for instance. These days, maybe one would not recognize the category of basic research as even existing. I mean, if you take all those Science Academy statements at face value, then science is always in the service of society. That's what makes it worth public expenditures for the doing of science. And then we see a gradual elaboration of this governance framework to take ideas of ethics on board beginning in the 1970s. We see the very well-known 1980 Act in the US that says that if publicly funded research is carried out in universities, those researchers have an affirmative duty to make sure that their research gets out into the production domain by organizing with the private sector to get intellectual property rights and further development opportunities for the research. So from 1950 to 1980, about a generation, one can see an elaboration of the Bush framework for doing science policy, and then we started getting a series of shocks, not just in the United States or Europe, but the world over, suggesting that some kind of rethinking in this idea of what the social contract was perhaps called for. So a need for a new kind of social contract in European contexts, again, interestingly, not in American, there arose this talk of mode 2 of science, in which science and society are deeply enmeshed from the beginning, and across all of these societies as well, an increasing recognition that innovation, as we've already heard, lies in between, in the margins, in the intersections, and the term convergent technologies is one of the terms that most captures that set of developments. So by the turn of the century, it's widely recognized that the old social contract of science with its linear model, that is no longer going to suffice, and a different set of understandings, including different relationships with society, are called for. But here again, I think we are on very well-trodden paths. The public steering of science is not new. It's not new as a topic of reflection, and it's not new as an instrument of policy, a place where we do policy making. So if we're talking about aligning interests, it's not just aligning the member states with the Commission and with civil society, although those alignments are significant and important. It's also aligning in general the mechanisms of governance that we already have with what civil society wants out of science and technology policy. And so, again, it's well to point out that we're talking about buildings whose foundations already are quite well laid and ancient in some cases. And the question is, how do we build the superstructure on these foundations? To what extent do they need to be redug? So there are 4 major mechanisms that, broadly speaking, can be thought about as mechanisms for aligning the interests of science and technology, or the doing of science and technology, with publics and with public values. And I want to suggest that each of them has shown that it is not enough. So I will go through them fairly quickly because each one is worth several lectures in a sense. But they are markets, regulation, ethics, and most recently, especially on this side of the ocean, the idea of public engagement. And I want to suggest paradoxically that even public engagement, which after all is code for democratization, does not do the job of alignment that we want. And I want to then segue to the climate change example and talk in a little more detail before I finish up about why these mechanisms don't work so well or leave things to be addressed in the practice of implementation. So markets offhand, I mean, you know, it sounds very nice. Give people things, their preferences will dictate. What could be a better way of aligning the interests of society with the interests of science and technology? But we've discovered repeatedly that the product focus of the market turns out not to be enough. And we have a natural experiment here because the United States went forward, bulldozed ahead on the development of biotechnology, saying that the product focus was what we needed to care about, that it didn't matter that biotechnology was a particular kind of process. After all, at the end of the day, what meets the public is the products, and therefore, as long as we have the products regulated, that's good enough. So we've had a huge global experiment in whether that American understanding of how to regulate biotechnology was adequate for the world, and I think the answer has come back resoundingly, no, that was not an adequate way, because market solutions by themselves are not enough. And I'm not going to go through each bullet, but the point is that one can analyze each of these mechanisms and show that there are empirical reasons to call attention to the deficits. And I want to emphasize this is not to reject any of these mechanisms, it's to make a case for a different kind of politics at the end of the day. So regulation, you would think that regulation would in and of itself be a hugely important toolkit for aligning societal values and the values of science and technology. It's open, it's state-led, it offers opportunities for participation, and yet we've seen repeatedly that the regulatory structures fall victim to various kinds of things, including capture. Regulation in the neoliberal era delegates things to the market, so we get a kind of recursion back to market-driven problems. And again, although regulatory structures are supposed to be global in anticipation, they rarely are. They're constrained by national features, and they too don't work the way they should in achieving these alignments at the global geopolitical scale. Ethics, you'd think that ethics would come along and mop up the value problems that have been left open by these other structures, but at least in my country it has turned out that ethics is a device for privatizing what should be public values discussions. Many of the deepest ethical deliberations are carried out by institutional review boards, and we don't even know who the members of those things are. Think about each of your own countries, and think about whether there is a public bioethics commission, for instance, and think about the level of democratic control over that. I mean, is it an oxymoron to even talk about democratic control of bioethics? In some countries, not. In Germany, for instance, the Ethikrat is organized by parliamentary law, and you can go and see what it's supposed to be doing. In my country, that's not the case. Each president appoints his own bioethics commission, and there's nothing to say who the members will be or who they're held accountable to. And these are the very public deliberative bodies that are doing ethics. And then, paradoxically, the point about public engagement. Well, public engagement assumes a few things. It assumes there's a public already there, and it assumes that there is a thing called engagement. But it turns out that if you do the empirical sociological work, that is not the case. And we've had more than a century of political theory calling attention to the fact that publics self-organize to some extent. They're not already there in advance. And if you go out looking for the public, it'd be like Diogenes looking for, truth-telling people or whatever. I mean, you would have a hard time identifying the public. And therefore, making public engagement exercises becomes itself a kind of technology, and it is not always the most successful way to go. Too much too soon is a thing we know about, but too little too soon is also a problem, and it's often the problem of trying to do public engagement. And then certain kinds of issues get repeatedly silenced in these kinds of mechanisms that we've seen. So even in my own field of scholarship, the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower already called attention to is not something that we're able to study as a part of the way in which science and technology are developing, simply because a lot of it is confidential, it's closed off, there's no access. And what about the academic industrial complex that things like the Bayh-Dole Act gave rise to? Again, they have created within universities certain kinds of pockets of privatization that fly in the face of the openness that was repeatedly called for by the commissioner. How can you have all of these open systems if indeed we're secluding a lot of what is happening behind veils such as intellectual property? Ethics, most major pharmaceutical companies today have their own ethics bodies, and if you think the public ones are not particularly accountable, think of Novartis's ethics committee, and what do we know about that? I mean, so quite elementary rules of democratic behavior are not carried out in these kinds of domains. So let's go through one example for why any of this matters. And climate change appears, as the minister reminded us from the beginning, on any of today's top 10, top 5 hits in terms of grand challenges, and especially this week with COP21 going on, we have even more reason to be aware of this. But what is the challenge, and what should we be doing about it? What should research in particular be doing about it? And I want to frame the rest of what I'm going to say with 2 images. These images are both taken from recent newspaper accounts. One is that, which was the lead image in the New York Times' article about COP21 on day 2 or something like that. And it drives home an obvious point, obvious to all of us in this room, namely that technology is going to have to play a part in whatever the solutions are. But note the ways in which technology is being depicted there. The human is almost not relevant to the production, let alone the uptake and use of these technologies. The linear displays suggest a straight line into the future. They're clean, they're modern, there's nothing of friction, nothing of dirt, and certainly nothing of politics in the imagination conveyed by the way in which grand technologies will meet up against grand challenges. And in geoengineering and the advocacy for it, we have a kind of ultimate playing out of that sort of vision of how to deal with the global grand challenge of climate change. But that is an image also from this week, and it is a very different representation. And it, of course, is the symbolic protest by the people who are going to stage a protest march in Paris, and it's at the Place de la République, and it's a selection of shoes that are meant to stand in for the people who are not going to be able to march, partly in justifiable response to the Paris attacks of just a couple of weeks ago. I showed these images to my very smart class at Harvard, and they interpreted the images as only today's young can, because they're used to the language of visualization as an analytic language, and they pointed out many things about the shoes. They pointed out, for instance, that the people who would stand in those shoes were children, and they were varied, and the shoes were used and suggested forms of life. Nobody pointed out that the shoeless are not in this demonstration. So if we're talking about the global world, and we're representing the marching with shoes on the feet, then necessarily we're not talking about the barefoot masses of the world and where they are in these politics. So we're talking about a dehumanized technological politics and a humanized politics of protest, but whether either of these is global or not, and in what sense, the images force us to think about those issues. In the climate change debate, there are four major unanswered questions, which I think relate to the grand challenges point very directly. From what standpoint are we looking at climate change? Is it the one that Carl Sagan so eloquently talked about? And like John Holdren, he was a colleague of mine because I spent much of my life at Cornell, and Carl Sagan was a great supporter of science and society initiatives in academia, and then John Holdren was my colleague at Harvard, so these are people whose attitudes I know well. But from which standpoint? Is it the standpoint of the globalized statistical view, or is it the standpoint of the person actually sitting in the parched earth? From what baseline are we talking about the needs? Is it developing countries, is it developed countries debating nuclear power with a tech billionaire like Peter Thiel writing in the New York Times earlier this week about how the new nuclear is the way to go and that's how state policy ought to run? Or is it talking from the standpoint of so many Indian villages in which the cow dung patty is still the major source of fuel, and it's against that backdrop that Prime Minister Modi's highly controversial desire to build more coal-fired power plants is being presented as a way forward. But the baseline does matter. If you put the coal-fired power plant in the crack between the pictures, what would the politics of that look like? By what means are we supposed to approach? Are we supposed to represent the problems? Is it the means that science knows, or is it the means that people experience? Whose voices are going to count as the producers of knowledge? And to what effect? So the ethical discussion has not yet been answered, and it's been raising the same questions over and over again for now 25 years. Should history matter? Should it matter how the problem arose? Look at the need. Should all emissions be counted the same way because carbon is carbon is carbon, which is a scientific way to think, but it's not the only science in a world in which Wissenschaft means systematic knowledge, because it's possible that the ethics of carbon generation ought to play a part in the way in which we construct the market. And then, should we be looking at per capita things or nation-by-nation things? That is a point on which major economists disagree. Joseph Stiglitz, for instance, thinks that we should be looking per capita and not at the national level. But politically, we're looking at the national level. And then what about the single carbon market? This cartoon, I think, remains one of the most powerful. It's called the Yo Amigo cartoon, and it remains one of the most powerful statements about global inequality that exists in the visual record of climate change. But it's not only an old cartoon that we need to look at. We can look at the person who may today be the world's only moral leader of any stature or standing, and we know that in particular, the encyclical of the earlier part of the year specifically took aim against carbon markets, and it's produced a lively debate within economics about whether the Pope's science is as good as his economics. But the point is not whether the Pope's science is as good as his economics. The point is, how do we segue from the science to the economics as if it is a smooth transition, and as if the carbon market is the only possible solution, and as if putting a price on carbon, a singular price, is the way in which to go forward. Those debates are not really happening in a politically rigorous fashion. So are we actually in an era in which a grand challenge is how to be global without alignment? So that is an image of the Bandung Conference of 1955, in which the non-alignment movement actually got going. And a lot of the research in my field suggests that we should be paying more theoretical attention to the science of difference and to creating things that are not necessarily smoothly aligned in various ways. So each of these terms, again, could fill books and do fill books. But should we be thinking more about hybridity? Should we be thinking about civic epistemologies that are tied to national culture and are not uniform even all over Europe, let alone all over the world? Should we be thinking about people's imaginations and the imaginations with which people go forward, constructing things out of science and technology? And should we be introducing a concept of epistemic justice into our ethical deliberations of the world, granting that people have a right to know things in different ways that come out of experiential backgrounds and historical particulars? These are open questions, but they're questions that are not in COP21. So I will finish up by talking about probably the one title out of all my reams of written work that has found the widest circulation, and that's Technologies of Humility. But as a person who is inclined to at least be reflexive, if not totally humble, I have asked myself why people are so taken with this title, Technologies of Humility, and I think it's because people have questions. Each of the things that I've suggested would be technologies of humility in decision-making carry their own questions. So framing, shouldn't we be looking at framing? Shouldn't we always be asking not just what are the grand challenges, but what are other ways in which the questions could be framed? Should we not always be asking who is the weakest, who is the most likely to suffer? Who loses and who wins, the questions of distributive justice, and learning, who is even the we and how can we learn better? And so let me suggest that the approach that I would like to see myself is a little less of the grandness of the challenge and perhaps a little more humility in the face of the science-society interactions, and that a prescription, a set of abstract prescriptions that have very concrete recommendations one can attach to them, suggests that we should be looking at the silence as much as the expression, what issues are neglected, that we should engage with history and not just remember it iconically, that we should restore the normative concerns that get washed out so easily when we're doing science, and that the communicative strategies are not just about the public being heard, but equally about scientists making themselves and their visions known to publics, and in the process maybe being forced to articulate what those visions are in a way that the image of those technologies that are going to clean up the earth with green fuel production do not do. I mean, so come clean, and don't just turn clean in the energy system, but come clean about what is involved in going in those routes. So with that, let me stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sheila. We have just a couple of minutes before we break for an alignment of tea and coffee. But I think having raised so many different thoughts there about the divergence of publics, the need for different questions, the relativistic baselines, the silent issues, the deficiencies of public engagement, I'm sure there are things you want to ask. I'd rather you ask them rather than me. We're talking all about the importance of speed here. So if we can cut the customary awkward gap before the first question, that would be great. Or comment. Otherwise, I'll keep it all from the stage. Come on, this is the new infused Europe we're talking about here. Surely, are you really wanting to sit here and leave it all to me on the stage? Excellent. Now, you have a microphone in front of you. I know there's a button written on it saying don't touch it, but do touch it and talk into it.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. And actually, you have raised quite a few new views and points to be taken from the very much aligned thinking that it doesn't rule in the States, but also rules in Europe. Now, my question is, can you propose in any specific manner where all this non-alignment can be taking place? For instance, how to involve the society, the civil society, in this very open communication. I found that the most difficult to do. It would be digital technologies. I mean, it would be this new way of communication through digital that allows the public to really get engaged and have a real conversation, not being, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously that's an enormously important question, and not. I mean, so my first answer is don't go for once and for all solutions. I mean, people tend to think that, you know, science and society is a a silver bullet mechanism and one can find the ideal thing. But I think that my very broad view of this is that once you recognize that science and technology are modes of governance and not just neutral representations of what is going on in nature, then all of the thinking, 2,500 years of thinking of political theory, need to get reapplied to the domain of scientific and technologically advanced societies. And there, of course, we're not lacking tools and instruments. So we can say democracy, but democracy means something vastly different today from what it meant to Plato. I mean, you know, that these things have changed. And in federalist systems, including global society, we have a lot of ways of thinking about non-alignment as well as alignment. So the whole principle of subsidiarity in Europe is a very important principle, which for us goes by the name of federalism, but it's the same idea, that some issues can be left to local settlement and need not be settled at a universal level that is very high order. So the question is, which ones, I mean, it's the beginning point of discussion, not the end point of discussion, but the point is that there are words, there are principles with which we already recognize heterogeneity of practice. It's just that science's claims to being universal tend to override in the scientist's imagination the idea that there could be disparate resolutions in disparate places.
But don't we need to be careful not to use that as an excuse to lose momentum? Because we spend a lot of time in Europe, taxonomy, classification, categorization, debating things, reframing the questions, trying to regroup things, and we are up against the clock here.
Well, why are we up against the clock, and what clock are we up against? And is it obvious that there's only one way to stop the clock? You know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been moving its clock ticking back and forth in the last 5 minutes of the clock now since 1945 practically. I mean, you know, so, you know, they only use those last 5 minutes to demonstrate how close to the doomsday scenario we are, but they occasionally move it back and occasionally move it forward. That could be taken as a metaphor.
But the climate change clock or the water clock or the oil clock or the energy clock or the population clock or the aging society clock, they're not going back and forward, are they?
They are, depending on how one puts the problem. Because
give me a way that it goes backwards. I'd like to hear that.
Well, I mean, if you pick up the newspaper on any given day, they will tell you happy stories. So, for instance, yesterday's newspaper, the New York Times for me, told me that Germany had achieved the unthinkable, which is modest growth and yet not increasing emissions. So, you know, it is in a sense going back because it was a dogma that you couldn't have growth without increasing emissions. If this is indeed the case, then one would have to say something about that. But the point isn't only that. The world is already not in a place where the clock is the same everywhere, okay? I mean, so if you take a per capita view of, say, a country like Senegal, those people are living in something much closer to sustainability in a global sense than people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, even though we happen to be a relatively climate-conscious polity. I wouldn't be here if I really took climate change seriously and looked at aircraft emissions and my contributions. I mean, you know, there are those kinds of things, right? So the clock ticking is itself a metaphorical framing of a set of issues that ignores the fact that clock time is not the same everywhere in the world, and not every place needs to go back. And it is itself creating a kind of race, a set of priorities, a set of imperatives. And I just don't buy into the fact that we should all accept this urgency rhetoric in the same way. I mean, it's worth talking about the debate unleashed after the Paris attacks, where many right-thinking politically minded people think that the talk of emergency, urgence, is itself something that needs to be investigated and rethought. Well, if I am right in believing that science and technology are instruments of governance every bit as much as declarations of emergency by other people, we should at least stop and ask the empirical questions. Where is the urgency? And maybe the urgency, if the urgency is not equally felt everywhere, then maybe we should concentrate our policy attention not at the scale of the globe, but at the scale of those places that are urgently contributing to problems. And, you know, even my president the other day did acknowledge that America has a special responsibility. It's just that his Congress does not seem to believe that. So, you know, this is a political problem that is not global. It is to some degree local and national, but we need to think about it. There's nothing God-given about sovereignty. You know, why do we have nation states? Why do we have the capacity of the American people, because of something that happened in 1776, to in effect declare climate policy for the world? Maybe our international lawyers ought to be thinking very carefully about what that system ought to look like. Right now, it's a crime if you buy votes in the US. And the US can reach out and get you. But is that a world order that we should be prepared to think in terms of? I mean, maybe international law today has a special obligation to reframe questions of what international means in connection with global problems. I mean, these are just some directions of thinking.
Right. And I will try and not think about the clock, which is telling us we should have broken for coffee, because that's just the thing moderators do. But I do want to give a chance. There is a hand there. I can just, if you're right at the back and you've got a hand up, you have to stick it up really high because the lights are in my eyes. But we'll go there if you put your mic on.
Okay. I liked very much your slide about spaces for differences, Sheila. And I was wondering whether that you would advocate more space for experimentation in the way we are tackling the challenges in Europe, and maybe in the next round of the framework program, that we could allow more space for experimentation, looking at more at social innovation, working research more closely with communities, looking at, you know, a lot of these tensions that are rising at the moment are kind of bubbling tensions in communities that we're not maybe listening closely enough to. So this is just an idea. I don't know whether it's something that you had in mind of how we could practically take it forward.
And can I ask you for the briefest answer you're comfortable with?
Yes.
Great.
But the but is that experiments are only as useful as the capacity to draw lessons and then to generalize. So one has to be careful to keep both of these strands going. I mean, so the differentiation, the local experimentation and so forth, yes, a resounding yes to that. But it's not going to do anything unless we're capable of extracting conclusions from those experiments and maybe building some kinds of generalizations as well.
Okay, we will have to leave it there. Can we please one more time give a round of applause to our opening keynote, in fact, our only keynote of the day, Sheila Jasanoff.
Thank you.